Right.
Right. So today we're going to talk about varieties of mead. Everyone can see the PowerPoint on the screen, correct?
Yep, you're all set.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So what we're going to be doing is kind of going over all the varieties of what you can do with mead. Some of them are period, some of them are not. I've kind of spelled out which is which and where to look for more. There will be some talk of chemistry. Don't get scared. It's okay. But math is a fun part of brewing, or you can ignore completely and just hope for the best. But we'll talk about a variety of ways to do that too. So to start off, kind of an overview. We're going to talk about sweet versus dry mead, the flavors of the honey itself, and then get into some things you do to the mead itself, Brochette, adding fruit and fruit juices, spices, and different kinds of grains. Okay, so to get going, everybody has hopefully understanding that mead is just wine made from honey. So honey plus water and yeast ferments the simple sugars in the honey and makes an alcoholic beverage. So what determines what kind of mead you get? Well, you put the honey in the water and you let the yeast start to do its work. It's all based on the percentage of sugar and the percentage of water. So a lot of people drink mead for the first time and they're expecting something heavily sweetened, like heavily sweetened tea. And they're sometimes honestly a little bit disappointed. You get this stuff that tastes like an unaged white wine. It's just kind of a little bit of yeasty overtones with some kind of background residual floral taste. And they're expecting this whomping hit of sugar. And some people love their dry mead and just don't like having sweetness at all, thinking it should all be fermented. The main factor in this is how much honey and therefore how much sugar you add in the beginning. We have a handy little tool for this. Well, there's a couple actually, a refractometer or a little hydrometer that shows the density of the water itself. Will give you a percentage of how much sugar is in it and therefore how much alcohol can be made out of it. So basically you put the sugar in the water, the yeast will process all the sugar until they get to a point where they just cannot eat anymore and make any more alcohol. At that point, fermentation will stop. That point for just wild yeast that may just fly into your brew pot, it's usually about between 5 and 8% of, we call it a weight to volume solution, or if using metric, 8 grams of sugar in 100 mLs of water, which is about the sweetness of, let's say, your average like apple juice or such. The yeast will go through that, they'll process it all. But if you're using wild yeast, especially over where we are in the West Coast, you can have some spoilage organisms in there, and there's usually alternate forms of yeast or bacteria that make it into vinegar, or wild molds or things can also ruin your brew. So if you use specialized yeast, there are a couple strains. Yeast is a manufacturer of single strain yeast, including mead yeast, modern manufacturer, obviously. It goes up to 11% alcohol before it stops. And then a dry mead yeast will go up to 18% alcohol. And that's your full white wine alcohol percentage. So an important thing is that yeast is not a magic thing that you can turn on and off. It's a living organism. So there is some variability. It varies based off of what temperature you ferment at, what other things you may have in there besides just pure sugar. But you usually get about 11%. So if you add more than you can accommodate to that 11% alcohol, and your residual will come through as sweetness. With the dry mead yeast, you're talking about a huge amount of honey in water, and it will usually drink all that up. But if you calculate out how much sugar to add to get that residual 18% alcohol, and then you add more on top of it, you can actually get a very strong, very sweet mead. And it's all about what you want to do. The nice thing is, if you don't like math, don't worry, you don't have to figure this all out ahead of time. You can basically open your fermenter, kind of pour off the top part, leaving the residual dead yeasties in the bottom, along with any bits of honeycomb and such, and put it in a new fermenter, usually called re-racking. And you can keep doing that, and you could add more honey in each time until you get something that's about what you would like. So sweet mead in general, you're going to have between 2 and 8% residual sugar. And like I said, we just use a grams per 100 ml. And you can also tell that there's a few handy brewing devices like the hydrometer that you can tell how much sugar is still in there. And between that 2 and 8%, Gatorade is about 6%, whereas pure fruit juice can be around 8 to 12%. If you're thinking about the final flavor that you want. Most adults who like a moderate amount of sweetness, you're talking about 3 to 4% for a finished sweet wine type taste. Now, this takes a little bit of experimentation, but like I said, you can just keep going, adding more honey as you go and try and get the flavor that you're looking for. And I did say add honey, not sugar, because sugar, depending on how your taste buds are, sugar does taste different than pure honey, and table sugar has different concentrations of different sugars than honey typically has. So when we're adding more to kind of keep it a sweet mead, we do want to actually just add honey and not sugar. Okay. So that gets us around to still or sparkling. If you run your fermenter until everything is just used up and the yeast have stopped working, you'll put it in bottles and everything will be fine, except it's not. So as the yeast sits in there for, say, a year or two, it will continue to metabolize a small amount of the sugar, which produces gas, which produces carbonation. You can do this on purpose if you just add a little bit of sugar, usually a teaspoon to each full-size bottle. We'll just about do it for a carbonated mead. Obviously not period, but something people like. You can also stop any carbonation by adding sodium metabisulfate. Some people do swear this adds a little tangible, almost Band-Aid-like overtone to your mead. But it does stop any further fermentation. Will stop your bottles from exploding accidentally, which most brewers do usually just once, and usually we figure it out. But sometimes accidents do happen. You can also, if you want to get super fancy, you can cask it in like an oaken cask that's used for wine. I've seen people use old Jack Daniel's ones, but just remember your starting mead is probably a lighter flavor, and a lot of your casking is in oak, which will add a very strong flavor to the mead. That's what you're aiming for, great. If not, just kind of keep that in mind. And also you can just pour into a keg, add carbonation just like you would beer. Just when you do that, don't expect a beer foam head. Just expect a carbonation more like you would get from champagne than with a proper foam head for beer. There are several calculators. Brochette is one that you can calculate how much honey you're going to add, what the residual sugar you should be getting, and then it will add in priming sugar also for you too. So you can kind of calculate beforehand, oh, how many pounds of sugar will I be adding? I kind of switch back and forth between standard and metric. Brochette is an excellent calculator because you can actually just choose whichever ones you use. If you want to use pounds and pints, you can do that. If you want to use kilos and milligrams, you can also do that. By the way, if there's any questions, I do not have the chat window open, so just kind of somebody chat, or I could just open the chat room. Just kind of post it in the chat or speak up. Either one works. All right.
No questions yet.
Okay, so the first part of adding flavor to your mead is the honey that you start with. So you will see honey sold as different things, lots of different varieties depending on where it comes from, and they're all kinds of meads. The honey that's collected by the bees influences, or the nectar that's collected by the bees influences the flavor of the honey. One of your most common ones is orange blossom honey, which means the beehives are situated right by citrus groves. Now, the bees will fly out. You can't just contain them to one grove. So you get some other flowers mixed in there. And you do actually get a light citrus flavor to the honey itself. It does directly influence it. One of the New World ones, avocado honey. It's a little bit more acquired taste. It's an odd combination, but just so you start thinking of some of the flavor profiles that you have. Of note, and I sometimes get in emotional discussions from people about this. In theory, when you're making mead at home, you would heat the honey mixture with water to 160 degrees for 10 to 15 minutes to pasteurize it. That gets rid of any wild yeast, that gets rid of any bacteria. Then you let it cool back down to 90 degrees Fahrenheit and you add in your yeast and it starts to ferment. Some people really like the natural process. That's great. I am somewhat on the cheap side, and some of these larger batches, you're going to be spending $50 to $75 on a really nice honey. I don't want to take any chances that that will go wrong. Whereas if you want to try wild fermentation and see what kind of microbes fall in your area, you can try it. Just try it in, let's say, 1 gallon batch and see what falls in there, see what kind of result that you get. There are several suppliers of wild honey or unprocessed honey. If you don't want to heat it up and pasteurize it, at least when you get the honey, run it through a little sieve, and that will get out all of the little like bee legs and feelers and wax chunks that may be in there, just so they're not in your finished product. So the honey flavor, just some examples of what you can do with it. It does entirely depend on where it is, and each local area will have its own flavor. So wildflower honey in Germany is going to taste different than wildflower honey in West Coast United States. Some of the more popular ones are buckwheat. Buckwheat has kind of like a malty overtones. It has a darker honey. It's also delicious honey to use on pretty much anything. You don't even have to put it in mead. The citrus, as you noticed before, just does have some actual citrus overtones. It's kind of nice. Clover or alfalfa, it does have some sweet grass notes, kind of a bright, a little bit of a grassy overtone, like you just mowed the lawn. Usually it's not overpowering, but you can just be kind of noticed. Wildflower means we just kind of put the bees out in the wild, not by a particular field, and they just kind of get honey from everywhere. On a note, there is actually good evidence that if you drink wild honey, which is unprocessed from your area, you can help your allergies. Somehow your body does recognize that and help you with it. Now, a lot of your lighter meads, they can have more alcohol content, but not so much residual sweetness, or if you don't add additional flavors. This is the main flavor of your mead. So if you just use pure orange blossom honey and you stick it in, ferment it, get a nice dry mead, it will have those citrus overtones to it, and there'll be a significantly detectable flavor. As the mead gets a lot sweeter, those undertones are sometimes a little bit more difficult to note. So you will have more of your underlying flavors from other compounds in more of a dry mead where you can taste more of the flavor. By the way, the little bee guy at the top is actually harvesting from mesquite, which is something that I've found out west. It has a nice kind of woodsy, almost like a campfire flavor to it, where if you make a dry mead out of it, you get something very nice. It's very nice carbonated with a kind of like a little smoky overtones. Goes well with lightly barbecued vegetables or fish. That was just a fun one I made early on. Okay, so your first period recipe in here, a lot of things obviously are just, add honey to water, obviously, and you make mead. And obviously mead has been going on longer than written recipes for it. But one of our first recipes specifically from the medieval period, after the Roman stuff we'll get to a little bit later, is 1393. And it's called Brochette, or depending on where you come from. It is technically French, but was made in a few different places. From the 1393 recipe basically has honey that's caramelized over high heat. You will hear a lot of people say, oh, Brochette, that's the burnt honey. It is not burnt honey, please don't burn it. Not only will you never get it unstuck from whatever you do, it will taste horrible. It will taste like charcoal mead, which is not good. So I talk about this a lot in my malt class, but yeast eat simple sugars. If you caramelize the sugar, you actually chemically stick it together to a longer chain, and it is no longer processed by the yeast. Therefore, that sweetness and flavor will go into your final mead. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It tastes like caramelized sugar. So, and once again, just like our original slide, you can make it sweet, you can make it dry. If you make it dry, you're going to taste a lot more of those caramel overtones, kind of like if you've ever had unsweetened cola. It just tastes a little different. Some people like it, some people do not. But if you make it sweet, then you get the sweet overlaying caramel layers. So when I said don't burn it, also just really be careful. Honey tends to heat up a lot like sugar does, which means you can get it 200, 300 degrees. And your last step in this recipe is pouring water directly on something that's about 300 degrees. Turn on a fan, open a window, be careful, don't put your face directly over it. It will bubble up a lot, and then you have to quickly unstick it from the bottom of the pan to stir it in. So that's where that last note comes in. Don't wander off, because you will go, if you look at the little honey scale on the bottom, those last few minutes are critical. Kind of like for those of you who made a roux while cooking or getting pancakes just right. If you wander off for a few minutes, you may go through several stages and wind up with something that's say on fire on your stove, and then that's not going to be any good. Also with the brochette, if you're going to caramelize it, no reason to use good honey. Just use your standard Costco, whatever, bulk honey that comes in a giant jar. You're not talking too much about the flavor of the honey, and because of what you're doing to it, a lot of that final flavor, if you get a nice delicate orange blossom honey, it won't follow through. Now, if you want to take your brochette and when you're, say, re-racking it, make it a little sweeter by adding some orange blossom honey, obviously that will. But just expect that any of the honey that you use here, it's not really going to carry through its nice final flavor into your mead. It will just carry that caramel flavor. All right. Next up, metheglin. So metheglin is spiced mead. It can be alone or in combination. So I've kind of broken this up into period, possibly period, and just stuff that is fun. Period spices, we know they use cinnamon, clove. The star is by the clove. Please be nice with clove. After you've done a few judging competitions, you really get tired of people who do a lot of cloves. Clove also acts as an anesthesia agent to your mouth, a topical anesthetic. So if you drink something very heavy in clove, you will not be able to taste anything for 15 to 30 minutes. You will just taste clove. Now that's great if you just had a tooth out and you put clove oil on it to make it stop hurting so much. It doesn't work so great if you're 8 out of your 20 tastings into your judging run and you have to get scores for everybody. In general, too much clove is more than 1 clove per gallon. I know that sounds like it's not much, but literally 1 clove per gallon. You want something that's super clovey, maybe 2 cloves per gallon. That's about it. Going more than that will just get in something that's not necessarily very drinkable. Ginger, grains of paradise, long pepper, bay leaves. A few of those are in that 1393 recipe we just talked about, previous slide. Musk, rose water, hyssop, rosemary. These are all period things that were added to meads. Musk is an acquired taste. I would say sniff it and taste it beforehand, before you just go dumping a whole bunch into your mead. Once again, make something that's drinkable and do it in small batches if you have a question. Yes, don't double the number of cloves. It seems funny to people that don't know. It's like, oh, I'll just put 1 clove in my gallon of stew. It will be fine. Don't double the amount. All right, probably period stuff, as in we know we were using this in period, but not necessarily that we were using it for meads. Mace, citrus peel, most of your herbs. And then licorice root is a funny one. We know it was, there was some record of it in Europe, but not necessarily in brewing, and also pines and juniper berries, which were used not necessarily in meads, but the crossover is not completely inconceivable, and it is documented in the reference I have on this, which is the clause of Sir Kellen Digby, which is after period 1693, but it has a lot of older recipes in it. Also think about what could be good, but is not in period. Peppers, some people like spicy meads. I do not, I can't handle spice. Vanilla is a great flavor to add to mead. Some people make mead from maple syrup instead of honey. It's called an acerglyn. I have not had one yet. It sounds super cool. Things like watermelon. If you make a mead out of watermelon, you might wonder, why is this metheglin? I think I put it in the wrong place. If you make a mead out of it, you get the seedy watermelon taste. The watermelon is not really juiced in any way. So it's funny, but a lot of people put this in the metheglin category rather than the fruit category. Yes, we will get to drinkability in just a sec. I saw that in the chat. So there's a nice quantity amount here for spices. If you're not used to cooking with spices, be super careful. It's very easy to overpower stuff with ginger or clove, especially. A little bit harder to do with cinnamon, but you can. And for example, how much mace do you add? I don't know. There's a little chart of how much to get light, medium, and strong flavors. If you're going to use a strong spice mix, once again, don't go all crazy buying the super fancy honey. You're going to overwhelm the taste, especially when using some of the stronger herbs and spices. If you want to couple them together, for example, using a buckwheat honey with a little bit of, I don't know what sounds good, cardamom, and maybe a little bit of grains of paradise. Those are more gentle flavors when using careful amounts, and you could probably taste the underlying buckwheat honey. But a lot of your more delicate flavors, going back to orange blossom again, well, those will get a little bit lost if you add in clove, ginger, and cinnamon to it. You can also think about what your final product's going to be. A lot of your ones with rosemary, bay leaf, things like that will be usually better dry. This might be just my own palate, but would taste a little bit different sweet. Whereas if you get a fully dry mead that's spiced with cinnamon and ginger, to a lot of people that might taste a little bit odd. All right. All right, melomel. So at some point, most fruits have been taken, if they have a sugar content, shoved into something and fermented in some way. It's just kind of the history of society itself. When you don't have stuff to make alcohol, you kind of improvise. So specific recipes on melomel are not really plentiful. A lot of them that do exist are, if you look at it carefully, it's kind of a fortified cider or fruit wine, just to kind of up the alcohol content. It also stops it on the other end from spoiling. If you get an 18% alcohol content instead of, say, a 5% alcohol content. So at some point they did recognize that and start doing that. So apples, pears, and other fruit needs to be juiced, usually pressed. Then the juice is added to the honey, as opposed to soft fruits, plums, peaches, berries, things like that, that you just kind of give a squish to and just slide them right into your fermenter. Once again, I always do a pasteurization step here. Some people do not like using it. In period, obviously, you see raisins in a lot of recipes. The raisins are there because of the yeast on the fruit, and that adds to the fermentation content. That's great. If it doesn't work, kind of sucks. And you get something that's super slimy and rotten and gross. So when you use stone fruits, please remove the center pits. They taste horrible, and they're actually kind of toxic if you let them soak for a long period of time. So you probably don't want to do that. If you're not sure, if you say you want to add a fruit, but you're not sure if you want to add it directly or juice it first, watch what happens when it goes bad. So apples, for example, are known for sitting on the tree and sitting on the ground for long periods of time in its whole fruit form before it finally spoils. In fact, on my tree right now, there's just one solitary apple still hanging there that I couldn't get to, and a couple of those that I can't reach. They still look like you could eat them. Whereas plums, peaches, berries turn to goo in your fridge if you just forget about them for a few days. Those are going to kind of disintegrate in your primary fermenter. Now, when they do disintegrate, peaches, plums especially, they will have something called pectin. Pectin isn't really a big deal. It makes the brew a little thicker. So you get a little bit more of a mouthfeel. However, it's cloudy. A lot of people want their mead to be nice and clear and see-through. You can use a pectinase enzyme, which is sold in commercial breweries. It's unlikely something like this was used, period, and that you just had kind of a cloudy thing with that leftover pectin in there. So when you add fruit, there's a couple different ways to think about it. Are you adding fruit flavor or are you adding pure sugar? With apple juice, depending on where you get it from, anywhere from 8 to 12% starting sugar, it will add apple flavor, but the more you add, the more sugar you add too. With other things like blueberries, you can get a lot of blueberry flavor from a couple pounds of it. You don't necessarily get fermentable sugar. So you're not necessarily adding more sugar by adding some blueberries for flavor, the same way you would when you get, say, a gallon of apple juice. Once again, you can do this on a calculator, but it gets a little shaky when you get to, well, I'm just, say, tossing some blackberries in there. I don't know how sweet they are, or you're just adding them for the flavor. So usually it's pure juice you're adding to the sugar content. Whereas if you add, say, a pound of squished fruit to a 5-gallon batch, you're not necessarily adding that into your sugar calculations, but you may have to kind of monitor it on the back end. All that sludge, by the way, on the used fruit, you're going to want to re-rack that or carefully pour it off and reset it in a new fermenter, maybe even 2-3 times, so you don't have that sludge in your bottles. It's not that it's just unattractive to look and see a giant sludge patch on the bottom. It will slurry into your drink, and unless you're talking about like a Bavarian Hefeweizen, this is not what you intend. It will affect the flavor if it kind of floofs up and gets all the way through your bottle. So when you go to taste this, let's say you just use pure apple juice, you're not even sure how it's going unless you carefully monitor the juice that's going in. You can always, once again, add more honey when you switch from one fermenter to another to kind of re-rack it. You take the specific gravity with your hydrometer, see, hey, how much sugar is in here? Pour yourself off a little bit, use sterilized spoons in boiling water, wash them off with bleach, and then rinse them. Whatever you want to do, just don't stick a dirty spoon in your fermenter. Take a little taste and go, oh, is this going the direction I want? Do I want to add more honey, or is it good? Once again, typically I'll mix honey with a small amount of water, heat up to 160 degrees, pasteurize it before I put it in there. So you're going to lose some yeast that way, but it usually works out okay. Okay, and obviously fruit, there's a lot of fruit that can be done. There's a little slide at the end that shows you kind of the full variety. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. So words are funny. Our next one is Pyrment or Hippocras or clary. And so Hippocrates actually, well, he's credited with inventing it. And there are actual older texts with Hippocras in it of some sort. But the real definition really varies. So what I've put here is kind of suggested definition. Some people may have an attachment to one definition or other. That's cool. We just say in our brewing competitions, please put the ingredients just in case you have somebody who's allergic to something, and you can call it pretty much what you want. So old wine that has maybe gone a little bad, you got a little vinegary with a sweetener. And that can be, if you're looking at, say, Greek recipes that may be adding sugar, if you're looking at later recipes in German or English, that may be honey. And you have Hippocras, which is kind of a sports drink, so to speak. So it's a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of vinegar, a little bit of sugar. Kind of makes the pH a little bit lower, makes it a little bit more acidic, and keeps for a little bit longer. And you can use it during the hot sun. It's very refreshing. If you're making new wine and you add honey to fortify it in that fermenter step, technically it's called Pyrment. And that can be either wine that you're actually processing now or wine that is finished processing and fermenting, and you add it to it, or in the beginning, either way. And you will get different flavors either way, because the yeast actually goes after that super simple sugar in the honey first, and all of your stuff from the grapes are kind of secondary sugars. So you will get very slightly different flavors if you just ferment grape juice versus if you fortify it with more honey first. Kind of subtle, but it does make a little bit of a difference. And obviously, as many varieties as there are of grapes, there's that many varieties of Pyrment. You will get a different flavor with Moscato, which is a wonderful combination with honey, as opposed to Merlot, which will have a little bit of a stronger, more red wine flavor, obviously. So if you use clear wine, which is wine that's been filtered, plus honey, plus maybe ale, and maybe do it at the beginning, maybe do it at the end, maybe use ale yeast, maybe just all mixed together, you get something called clary, which I highly suspect is kind of the medieval version of a kamikaze, where you pour all of your leftover booze in one thing and just kind of drink it. That's not official, but if you read some of the recipes, it's a little suspicious that that might be what they're doing. There's also note in all three of these of adding different spices, and a lot of times the process is not clarified. Like talking about clary, it's like, well, did you use new wine? Did you use vinegarized wine? Did you use fresh ale that's been sitting around a bit? It's not exactly specified, so feel free to kind of experiment. You do want to be careful with the grape juice. It is specified that it's using the juice. You will get a different product if you squish the grapes and put them in like you do peaches or some such. It'll be a vastly different flavor because you're getting the flavor of the skins. It's the difference between a rosé and the full Merlot. Speaking of, if you're thinking about wine, it will affect your final flavor. You can also use verjuice, which will give much more of an acidic and tangy flavor. It's unripe grapes. So consider that when you're adding it. And once again, raisins, when it says add raisins, it's not, you're not adding raisins so you get the nice raisiny or grape flavor. A lot of times they just say add raisins because that's a reservoir for the yeast. So you're making just a regular old mead. You go, oh, hey, this thing from Sip Through Time, which is in our references, it says add raisins. Well, I'm going to add it for a whole bunch of nice raisiny flavor, and it doesn't work out the way you expect it. Those raisins are usually in there as that source for yeast, as a nice way to add a whole bunch of yeast and get it going before they knew there was yeast, and that's what made beer. Also, you will notice that the old ale cake or residue yeast on the bottom, or the same wooden vessel we've been making the mead in for the last 300 years was used. And that gets just inundated with these yeast strains that seem to make favorable brews. So it's a much more organic process than we have today of putting in pure yeast strains, but it did work very well at the time in that area. All right, so braggot. What's the difference between a braggot and a barley wine? Well, I don't know. It can vary depending on what you say. If the primary thing is honey and you're adding in some malted grains as a sugar source, that's usually thought of as braggot. If you're brewing a beer first and then fortifying it with honey as you go, be thought of more as a barley wine, but definitions are kind of flexible here. It is a very old documentation, the Hymn of Ninkasi, which is, crud, I'm forgetting, I believe it's Sumerian Sumerian cuneiform just kind of stuck into clay is about making what is essentially a fortified beer or braggot. If you're looking at doing just a simple thing, you don't want to extract malt, which is another class I'm doing later, but it's kind of a pain and takes a while. You can use things of malt extract, super handy, available at all brewing stores, and you can just pour it in there and get usable sugars. But consider how much you're putting in, what kind of sugars it has, because when you start combining malt extract and combining honey, you're going to get something that's fairly high alcohol and may have a large amount of those residual sugars. Once again, yeast go after the simple sugars that are in honey first. So the more complex ones that come from the malt will be left over, and you'll get much more of a malty flavor than you might think from, say, making a beer than you do, or much more malt flavor than you do making a beer than you do if you just do pure honey with some additional malt flavor in there. So you want to consider that for your final product. So the yeast that you use have to tolerate high alcohol content. A lot of times people don't want to use mead yeast for this. They want those additional flavors you do get from a beer, whatever you're going to use. Wilhelm is a brewery in Germany. It's been around for a very long time. They have their own proprietary strains that have a high alcohol tolerance. You get nice, like creamy, orangey overtones to them. It's a wonderful thing to make braggot out of. And each yeast will do something different. Your IPA yeast, this is not really their strong point. They're not going to know what to do, and their flavors may be a little bit off. Whereas you're playing mead yeast is more specialized to just using honey sugars, and you may have a lot of leftover malt characteristics. And then once again, if you use something that's only for low alcohol beers like lagers, it may actually get killed off if you drop it into a super sweet solution and just not do anything. We usually call this a stuck fermentation or a failed fermentation. And you just need to add a second strain of yeast to just kind of get it going again. And then, so once again, words are tricky, but you don't really need to worry about it too much. If you want to call something, go for it. If you add hops, technically it's a methylene. Or is it a braggot because you're using grains? It's somewhere in the middle. It's a grain brew that's fortified with honey. Names are not too important, but realize you are making a braggot with the hops added that you use as a spice. Hops are an additional factor because they have to be boiled to get the flavor and preservative function out of them, just like when you're making beer. But you can also add hops. You can kind of boil them in a small amount of water and add them to your honey to get the flavor out of them after you filter them out. And you can add one and not the other. So if you add hops, technically, once again, you're making a methylene. If you add malt, it's technically a braggot. You can add one or the other or both. If you add a good amount of hops and a large amount of malt, you might find something that tastes a lot like a barley wine. That's commercially available. Whereas if you use honey as your kind of foundation, you will notice the flavors are a little bit different. You do get a lot more of the stronger honey overtones, a little bit of malt to it. And once again, hops are their own class. You can do so much with them. You can make it virtually undrinkable to making it just barely tasteable in your brew. Okay, so just to summarize, we have a few minutes left. We'll use a few minutes for questions. Don't be afraid to mess around and do different things. Try different stuff out. It's great. It gives you a few different options. Don't feel, I didn't mention, I also am the guild chancellor for the Brewing Guild of the West. And we do lots of like little competitions and judging. Don't be afraid to do something crazy and new. Try different stuff and see what you result with, so you don't spend so much money on something that may taste completely horrible. Try it in small amounts first, let's say a gallon size, and then keep copious notes, because the worst thing you do is like, I want to try this out and I'll try adding a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I'm not taking any measurements. I'm just trying this out. And you wind up with something really, really good that you're never able to make again because you can't remember what you did. Everybody's done it if they've been brewing for a while, and it's really a shame because something comes out really, really good. You want to make it again. So try new flavors, keep notes on it, see what you did that's great, see what you did wrong. Something goes horribly wrong. Maybe you make a peach sizer and you put way too much ginger in it. You can go back, you can learn from that and make something that's a little bit more palatable, for example. Also, don't just take your mead out of the fermenter and chug it down. The temptation is there. It's like, oh, the mead's finally ready, we're going to drink it. And this causes pained looks in the eyes of a lot of people. But bottle it up, cork it, and leave it for a couple of years in a dark, cool place. You will be rewarded. Your mead will develop in flavor, in color. It will be a lot more drinkable and a lot more tasty. Some of your yeast overtones that, unfortunately, in commercial breweries, you get a lot of yeast overtones. You get a lot of kind of plasticky overtones to it because they bottled and shipped their mead out straight away and they sterilize it. You just don't have that with home brew if you just kind of let it sit for a bit. And once that mead gets 3 to 5 years along, you'll find something that's really quite incredible that's not easy to replicate. And this is true for straight meads. It's true for fruit meads. It's especially true of sizers that have a whole different, super fun to someone who loves chemistry, fermentation path that changes one acid into another and mellows out the flavor. And you'll find different things happen over time. And also remember, the point is to just kind of relax, have fun, try not to tell people what to do, what not to do, and also what is allowed and what is not allowed. Just have fun and kind of experiment. With a couple exceptions, actually, if you jack things, or jacking is a way what you set out in freezing temperatures and pull off the water, and you're basically distilling it. If you do it by yourself, no big deal, but it's technically not allowed. So if you bring it to events, just know that it really isn't for official competitions, or if you go to any kind of mead competition, it's technically not something you're supposed to do. So yeah, but with a few exceptions, just have fun, experiment, and see what you can do. This is an excellent slide or diagram, I guess you'd say. That's kind of copied over from this wonderful little meadery, and I've referenced them in the comments. Fermenting things with sugar has been something that's taken place throughout the world over a long period of time, and there are all these different varieties. This isn't even all of them, but the countries of origin are there too. One of my favorites on here is actually Ictabenton, which I hope I'm spelling right, which is kind of like this honey anise rum drink from Mexico. It's lovely. And some people like Tej. The rose ones are nice and flavorful. But yeah, experiment, see what you like. Like I said, next on my boat is Acerglyn, which is made with maple syrup. And I've been requested to go back and do some more apple cider with apple pie spices, which is also wonderful. As you see on the chart, pretty much anything's open. Another thing to do is you can go by your local farmer's market. I know the peach growers are especially fond of this, but you can look for, hey, what do you have that just doesn't look very great? And you could get, I don't know, a 20-pound crate of whatever to squish and make into mead. Peaches get messed up so easily. Sometimes a lot of these are around, apricots, nectarines, even apples. Just all these wonderful things. If you contact your local people and your growers, local cideries, whatever you have around you, and local honey makers, there's a lot of wonderful things you can try. All right, gets us to our last slide, right about on time. These are a couple references that I really like to have around. Renfro, Sip Through Time, there's a lot of post-period stuff in here, but there's some good recipes on ale, on meads, and a good number on Hippocras, Pyrment, whatever you like to call it. The Complete Mead Maker is your basic book to go to when you start brewing mead, about how to do it, what's going on, and includes a lot of these categories about ideas of what you can do. And then the Wassail Measures of Mead is currently out of print. It's a nice little SCA style book that is great to have around. And usually you can pick up copies on Amazon used or on eBay for about 10 to 15 bucks. It's a great little reference. Okay. Any questions or things that have come up? We have a few minutes. Hopefully everybody's still here.
You're not alone. That was
Okay.
awesome.
Yes, thank you for a very informative class.
No problem. Also, if you are West Kingdom, even if you're not West Kingdom, whatever, you can join the West Kingdom Brewing Guild group on Facebook. It's a little quiet right now, and we're trying to kind of drum up some more people. Posting recipes, having little contests online, see what you're brewing. It's great to have a little community of people that are doing different things with brewing.
My sister-in-law makes mead and they're amazing. She played with an agave honey, and it's not bad. I don't know what she was expecting out of it, but if you're hoping for tequila, it doesn't go there.
No, it does not.
No, but it was lovely. It was very good. I do not have the talent. I made drain cleaner and more drain cleaner and more drain cleaner. So I leave this to her, but I'm almost willing to try it again. It's, it's appealing.
So I talk about this more in my whole grain brewing class, but it's almost always down to, if you did kind of what you were supposed to do in the recipe, it always comes down to sanitation. Did you do like a 7-step OCD cleaning process? Did you boil everything? Did you iodine everything? And everybody tells me, oh, this is complete overkill, but it will stop the sadness from happening a vast majority of the times.
I would say that is probably it, because I attributed it to wild yeasts. She's a cook. I'm not. My house probably doesn't contain the same sorts of wild yeasts going on. And if I missed cleaning anything, there was something unexpected going on.
Yeah. And it's even to a point, it's even shut your windows, turn off any air conditioning or heating you have in your house, make the air as still as possible, clean the rest of your kitchen first, which is pain, and nobody wants to do that. But yeah, sometimes you just get really bad luck.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll try again someday with very small batches.
Yes.
I'm gonna win eventually.
They sell 1 and 3 gallon fermenters, or carboys, whatever you want to call them. And those are great for side projects. I know this isn't necessarily friendly to most people, but I do like the plastic pails. The main difference being you can reach in the plastic pail to clean it out, as opposed to reaching through the neck of a little tiny bottle that's 5 gallons and is balanced on the edge of your sink. But once you break a 5-gallon glass carboy, you kind of don't want to deal with them anymore, because that's a lot of broken glass in your kitchen.
Please tell me it was empty, because my vision is that it was a horrible mess.
It was about halfway through cleaning out and had like a soap and water solution in it.
Okay,
in
that's
a small amount.
Bad,
Yeah.
but not as bad.
Yeah, the kitchen floor was really clean afterwards. Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop your recording. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. You're welcome.